Hey everyone, this is Chat Cemetery. Today's topic is all about the collection Different Seasons from 1982, and joining me today is Erin Qualey. Erin, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Of course, this is a very unique collection because a lot of these stories don't necessarily fall under the horror genre. They do have, these horror elements to them, but when you think of something like Shawshank Redemption, you don't really think of a horror story. And I think this is one of those collections that really made people think twice about who Stephen King was as a writer, because before this, he was sort of just shoehorned into the horror genre, which clearly he is perfectly fine with. He's mentioned that numerous times, especially when he was interviewed and things during the early releases. And, you know, he started in the 70s with short stories, then finally got some novels published in short story collections.
Yeah.
But we've hit the 80s, and this is a very big decade for him, I would say. It's a very
Mm.
busy decade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the drugs fueled him.
Oh, yes. Yes.
But yeah, no, I mean, it was interesting because I read this a long time ago when I was younger. I read Everything But the Last Story for some reason or another. And I read it was it before Shawshank the movie came out or right after? I hadn't seen the movie or something. I don't know. But I don't think I remember reading the intro because I was like, I don't know, in my teens and I wasn't into like reading intros or whatever. And I read it this time and he was like, oh, I like just had enough steam after all these big books like The Shining and I forget the other ones, but to sort of write one solid novella. And so I was like, oh my God, he's just a beast when it comes to writing. So these were just kind of, his extra energy, which I think is amazing. And they're all, I mean, especially, I don't know, they're all really good. I mean, I'm definitely partial to Shawshank just because like that movie holds a little special place in my heart. And it was definitely the first time that the world at large, when that movie came out, it was definitely the first time the world at large thought of Stephen King as, I still tell people that Stephen King wrote that and they're like astonished.
Yeah, same. I just had that conversation fairly recently with my cousin, and it was one of those things where she was like, "Oh, really?" That like because
Hmm.
you don't typically think of that kind of story as being a Stephen King kind of story. So it
No.
was one of those things where if you don't pay too close attention to opening or end credits, which honestly I don't. I mean, I'm trying to
Hmm.
focus on them a little more for the purpose of podcasts and everything like that, just because you can get some interesting things happening in opening scenes when the opening credits come in and everything like that. But, with this book collection, so far, 3 of the 4 stories have been adapted, and The Breathing Method actually has an adaptation in the process, and it'll
Yeah,
be
I
out
saw
in
that.
2020. So that'll be interesting to see because I think of the 4 stories, that one, it has a huge blow to it that you just kind of don't really expect. And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this one is definitely the most horrific of the 4
Yeah.
stories, kind of.
And there's no like very little narrative arc in that story either. So, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but I don't really, when I was reading it, I was like, I'm not really sure even if I would want to watch this as an adaptation on
Yeah.
television or on a movie. So, we'll see. I forget who bought the rights to it, but we'll see what they do with it, I guess.
Yeah, so why don't we just go ahead and jump right into Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption? Obviously, they
Hmm.
dropped the Rita Hayworth part for the movie
Yes.
adaptation, which it makes sense. Sometimes you don't want super long movie titles, but I will be talking about all of these adaptations as their own episodes as well. So we won't dive too much into those. We'll
Yeah.
focus more on the stories here. But reading this story, I did so after I had seen the movie. So then
Oh, hmm.
the differences were very noticeable. I was like, oh, they did that. And it was just one of those things where I think the story is even more brutal in
Hmm.
some regards because you have these things happening that they didn't necessarily depict in the movie, even though the movie is pretty doom and gloom at times. And
Hmm.
the story is even more so. And I think that just made it so much more powerful in a sense too. And don't get me wrong, the adaptation is like one of the best adaptations in
Hmm.
the history of adaptations, pretty much. And it's just a fantastic movie in general. And there are times where sometimes you don't like the differences, but I think in this instance it was okay. And reading it just gave me something a little extra to look forward to, because as you go through, you kind of get this feeling like, oh, okay, this is different. So maybe there's going to be something different down the line as well. And you definitely get that here. So it's like, all right, I'm very excited to see what this has in store for me, because I did things backwards and watched the movie first.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, sometimes when I try as much as possible to read books before I see movies or television shows or whatever.
Same.
Like, just recently when Sharp Objects came out, I was like, I'm not going to read the book because I want the surprise or whatever. And then I was like, nah, you know what? I'm going to read the book first because I want to have it in my head before someone else interprets it for me and whatnot.
That's exactly what I did with Sharp Objects too. I blew through the book like a week
Mm-hmm.
before the show started, maybe. I was like, all right, I sat down and read it in like 2 or 3 days. And I was like,
Yeah.
yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, those like mysteries are always, I can't, like I binge sometimes. I mean, Stephen King books, I binge those too. Like I just read his most recent book and I just couldn't stop reading because, you want to know what's going on, what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think with Shawshank, I know the movie came out in 1994 and I was like 10 then. So there was no way I wasn't reading Stephen King when I was 10. So
I was 2, so I wasn't reading it.
Yeah. And I don't think I saw, I definitely didn't see the movie before I read the novella. So I remember reading the novella, and the one thing in the adaptation that I was kind of upset about was that I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but what sticks out in my mind is in the book, he changes the poster like a bunch of times. And in the movie, I don't think he does. I think it's just
only like
I
2
think
or
it's like
3
Barbarella
times
or something. Oh, he still changes it. I don't know. But anyway, so, and I remember being like, oh, you didn't change the poster, but which is such a small thing. But the novella is so, I think it's like 100 pages, 100 and something change pages long. And so, to make that into a 2-hour movie is so much easier than making a long book like, The Stand or something into a movie, or hopefully they do a miniseries of that, but a new one. But I think that, and especially just reading it over again, especially because I was so obsessed with it when I was younger, I don't know, it definitely. And also after watching Castle Rock too, because it takes place in Shawshank,
right.
It was really interesting to kind of go back into that world and sort of remember Andy's plight, which was interesting. So, but it's so hard. Like I'm trying not to talk about the movie, and it's so hard to not compare to the movie. And I'm like, yeah, but that happened in the movie, but this is different. But it's just the way that Stephen King writes too, because there's not really any elements of, except for the sisters, I guess, but that's not really horror. That's just like Stephen King writing people as terrible people, which he's very good at.
Right. It's horrific, but not, necessarily horror.
Yeah. And there's really, there are other 3 stories. There's like little elements of horror in all of them. Like, Apt Pupil has the dreams, and the body has the body, and the breathing method has like the sort of element of the surreal in it. But this one is kind of just a straight up story about 2 guys in prison.
Yeah, this one, like a lot of his stories, they're very character driven. And sometimes he takes that a little too far, but I think because these are all novellas, it's sort of the perfect length to really dive into 2 or 3 characters in depth, and it just gives you so much out of it. And I think, obviously the body has a few more characters than 2 or 3 that they focus on because it's a group of kids, and we'll get to that in a bit, but he just really likes to give you everything he can about a character without making it feel too overwhelming necessarily. And like I said, he doesn't always succeed, but I feel like, especially with the book like The Stand that had a ton of characters, because of the length of the book, he was sort of able to break those characters down and give you what you needed out of each of the important characters. And obviously with Red in Shawshank Redemption, he's the narrator, so you're getting everything from this one perspective, but you feel like he's this really wise older man at the same time. You're like, he's been in jail for doing something wrong for a very long time, so obviously he wasn't the best person in the world prior to this, but he's still very humanized in this. When you have prison stories, it can get pretty dehumanizing pretty quickly. And we see that, like you said, in Castle Rock. The kid is in a hole in the ground, literally. not
Well, he
even in a real
deserves to be
cell.
there, but yeah, no,
Yeah,
no. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm not doubting that, but it's one of those things where, in that regard, they show the dehumanizing aspect of it because they don't understand. Well, they do understand what he is, but in this, you just have everyday people, and none of them have special abilities or anything like that. It's just a
Hmm.
straight up prison story, and these people trying to survive.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, even in Castle Rock, you do see. I liked how Castle Rock sort of tackled the modern day prison system. That's something that I'm interested in, like criminal justice and all of that. And the warden wanted to just sort of sweep the kid under the rug, even before knowing who the kid was or anything. Wanted to sort of sweep it under the rug and wanted to sort
Right.
of ignore it. And that's what happens in the book, in Shawshank the book too. And you see Stephen King throughout his books, he does write about prison, which is interesting because he does kind of have like a feel for it. So I always wonder like where he gets his feel for things that maybe might be out of his wheelhouse, because I don't think he's ever been to prison, but maybe he's talked to people who have been to prison. Like he's got an ear for lingo and things like that I at least make it feel very real. And the dehumanization of the prisoners to the guards, and how the warden kept Andy as sort of a pet and didn't want to let him
Right.
go. And I had remembered that part from the book, or from the novella, whatever you want to call it, where
Mhm.
Tommy comes in and he sort of tells him, oh, I can get you, oh, and that was a big difference from the movie too. They kind
Yes,
of just send
very
Tommy
big.
away instead of killing him.
I was like,
um,
oh, okay, all right.
yeah, I had forgotten that, and I was like, oh, good for Tommy in the book. At least he lives. That's good job. And I think that the dehumanization of just people in general is a big part of Stephen, like one kind of side of the spectrum of Stephen King's books, and then the other side is sort of the love that we have for each other. And I think Shawshank sort of exemplifies that really. Actually, The Body exemplifies that really nicely too. But Shawshank more than others, because they're in such a bleak, terrible place, and these two men kind of find each other and start this, not like a loving relationship, but not like a romantic relationship, but that, like a bromance. And they're really connected by the end of it. And I remember when I read the novella, the end, the end is the same dialogue as in the movie, but in the movie you get to see him find him. And I remember being so happy because I was like, the end of the novella it's not like concrete enough. You don't know if he finds him. And I was
Right.
like so upset. And I was like, okay, well, I guess because this was when I was a kid and I didn't really like open-ended things. And now I've grown to love that when things are a little bit more open-ended. But I remember being so disappointed. And then when I saw the movie, I was like overjoyed. I was so happy.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm glad that you mentioned Tommy, though, because in some ways, the novella is darker than the movie, but then in that instance, the movie went way further than the novella. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, that's very different. And it wasn't even that I was disappointed that Tommy didn't die. I was just like, oh, I see how that could go either way. And I'm kind of glad we have both takes on that, because then I feel like it affects Andy in slightly different ways in the novella and in the movie, because it's one thing for someone to be sent away and be fine, but it's another thing for them to just outright be killed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, in the movie he had like such a loyalty to Andy, and then in the book I was mad. I was like, oh, it just went away. He didn't say anything. Like that's sad, but he didn't die. And then Gil Bellows, the guy who played him in the movie, was actually in 11/22/63, which is like an interesting
Right.
little fun thing, which I loved. I loved that miniseries where they just like popped up all these like Easter eggs
Yeah, yeah.
from previous Stephen King things.
He does have a knack for doing that. And I haven't read 11/22/63. I did watch the Hulu series though. So it's one of
Mm-hmm.
those things where if you pay close enough attention, which I am attempting to do here, you can really
Mm-hmm.
pick up on this entire universe that he's built up. And obviously when we get to The Body, that's a huge story for him, because
Mm-hmm.
we see a lot of familiar names and faces from that story pop up. But before we get to that one, I do want to talk about Apt Pupil, because Nazi stories are very interesting to read, especially considering this was back in 1982 when it actually came
Mm-hmm.
out, and you're like, oh well, there's still people like this today. All right.
Mm-hmm. I know. oh yeah, who are fascinated with the Nazi culture and young white kids who are very squeaky clean on the outside. And I it's definitely very resonant now. I remember I don't know if I feel like I read this and I was so disturbed by it that I like wanted to see the movie because I was like, I want like a different perspective on it, and I don't remember anything about the movie, so it must not have been great. I think Ian
I have
McKellen was
not
in there or
seen
something,
it,
but
so.
yeah,
Oh,
it must
okay.
not have been great. But the novella is very disturbing. It's like it's like actually I would say probably, I mean, the breathing method's kind of disturbing, but I would say in terms of like human psychology, it's the most disturbing one of all four of these. Like I
Absolutely.
think I remember when I signed up for to talk about different seasons on the podcast, I was like, that cat scene where he puts the cat in the oven, that is like one that like has stuck with me forever, because I mean, I love animals and I don't want anyone to ever, I mean, people, it sucks when people get hurt, but animals are so innocent little, and
Right.
it makes me so upset when people hurt animals. And he like cooked it, and I was just like, I was just so upset. And it's just such a disturbing relationship between the two of them. And even though there aren't a lot of horror elements, that sort of rotting relationship theme throughout this novella is really, it kind of gets to you, I think.
The thing that's crazy with this one too is it's not even the Nazi guy who is the one doing some of these horrific things. He's
Mm-mm.
sort of been past that moment in his life, and he sort of just wants to be this hermit of an old man who just does his thing, and people leave him alone, and people don't know who he is because he has changed his name and everything like that. But then you have Todd, who keeps coming by and just prodding him for all of these stories when he finds out who he really is. And
Mm-hmm.
you see this turn in Todd, and he sort of goes from this innocent, curious kid to a serial killer. And it's just so fascinating what Stephen King is able to do in the short amount of time with this novella, because you get so much of these two characters that you're like, okay, this was nicely paced considering everything that happened. And you're just so disgusted with Todd by the end of it that all of these feelings just come up, and you're like, oh, it's like this was so good, but I hate it so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Stephen King, his sort of brilliance lies in the fact that he really does understand human nature. And he, this at the very end of Apt Pupil, Todd goes and he, starts picking people off from the overpass, and it's a mass. It was written in 1982, but it's a mass shooting. He's going out and using a gun to take life en masse. And I think that he's in his books, in Stephen King's books, he's talked about mass shootings. He's talked about, like, in the Dead Zone, he's talked about corrupt politicians, which has kind of come back. And he talks about things that are always topical because they're just like the roots of human behavior and the roots of evil and good. Because he always has, well, not in this book novella particularly, but in most of his books he sort of has, like, it is the it and the Stand are kind of shining examples of, he has the good guys and the bad guys, and they're sort of weighted out on either side, and the good guys quote unquote win. But in Apt Pupil there's no winning.
Yeah,
There's just sort
not
of
at
the
all.
dark side of the human existence and experience. And Todd is clearly this very disturbed young man, and this he finds this relationship with Tusander, and that sort of stokes the fire of his dysfunction. And he can't really talk to his parents, and his parents just want him to do well, and they want him to be the golden child, and they're not really paying attention to his, any sort of warning signs that he might potentially have problems. So, and I think, all of that applies to today's society. The Nazi stuff, the dysfunction in teens, and the penchant for violence, and mass shootings, and all of those things are very topical.
The parents are just so clueless because they
Yeah.
want to believe that he's doing something good. They think he's going over there and reading to this old man practically every day and spending hours upon hours with him because he's lonely. And they have no idea what's actually going on while he's gone. And it's just one of those things where this is certainly a time period where parents, I wouldn't say they were bad at being parents, but kids were allowed to run free a lot more than they are today. A
Mhm.
lot of parents are like, you can stay in the yard or you can stay on our street. And that's about it. Like, you can't go where I can't see you, sort of thing. Depending on
Yeah.
the parents. Not all of them are like that. Sometimes I see small children and I'm like, are you just walking home by yourself or something? Like, what's going
Well,
on?
and there's something to be said, like we're gonna get to the body in a minute, I guess, but there's something to be said for like when children are allowed to be free and run around and be out for
Yeah.
days at a time and not have the parents know where they are and all that. So there's definitely like a balance, but I feel like even in today's culture, there's parents don't necessarily want to do the hard work it takes to really understand their kids, or they're afraid of their kids, or there's a lot of different, the dynamics have shifted, but it's still where parents and people in general don't necessarily, like I'm a therapist, and so people don't necessarily know how to talk about mental health. Like they're afraid to talk about mental health because they're afraid to like open a Pandora's box, or they're afraid to like not be able to know how to deal with it or whatnot. And so I think it's just easier to see the positives and gloss over the negatives. Like I know, I didn't actually write any down, but I know that Todd is sort of showing warning, like, oh, he is at the big, at like the beginning of his relationship with Dusander, he's losing weight, he's like not doing well in his classes,
Yeah.
and the parents are concerned, but they're kind of concerned at a distance. They're like, oh, he's losing weight, but his grades are good. And it's like, well, is that really the metric that you want to use to measure your kid's success? Like, I mean, sure, grades are great or whatever, but like if your kid is wasting away in front of you and like being very distant, and like, don't you think you should talk to your kid?
It's almost like Dusander cares more about how well Todd is doing. He's the one who makes
Mm-hmm.
him get his grades back up, and he makes him study while he's spending all of this time with him. And he then sort of rewards him by telling him more stories and things like that. So it's kind of this push and pull between the two of them. Todd wants something out of him, but Kurt Dusander is going to make sure, the kid is doing something at least.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, when he starts to make this turn, it's just one of those things where Todd is clearly playing the long game. And
Mm-hmm.
because of Kurt's age and everything, I think he's just so tired and does not really want to deal with Todd as much as he probably could, considering the two of them spend so much time together. But it's also not his job. He's not the kid's grandfather or parent or anything like that, although he does pretend to be at one point, I believe.
Yeah, well, so I feel like Dusander, all the stuff he does for Todd is out of self-preservation because they're kind of playing
Right.
a sick game with each other. Like Dusander's never really, I mean, I feel like there's a couple points where he does actually kind of show some sort of weird twisted affection for Todd, but I mostly it's just self-preservation because he's saying, "Oh, I gave a letter to this friend and blah blah blah." So it's partially self-preservation, but it's also partially like his conversations with Todd awaken something in him, like awaken his old urge for power and his or his you know I don't know, penchant for violence, I guess, and control and things like that. And so they're both sort of engaging and they're giving each other permission to sort of engage in these negative behaviors. And so again, like I don't know, that phrase popped in my head earlier, but it's definitely like a relationship where they're both like sort of rotting each other. Like they're both sort of, not, and I feel like there's a lot of rotting imagery in this too, like the rotting bodies in the basement, the rotting log up on the overpass, and a lot of different things where it's sort of just nothing's really like healthy. Like it's all sort of crumbling apart, which is kind of what their relationship is doing to each other too. So it's, I don't know, it's the relationship's so toxic.
It almost surprises me too that this is a story that's still being published, because with his other novella short story, Rage, that was one, it was published initially, but then it was taken out of publication because of the effect it was having on these teenagers who were committing these mass shootings and everything like that. So to have that same sort of thing happen at the end of this story, when Todd just completely breaks and loses his sanity, I think, that's kind of surprising to me that they would take one out of publication and not the other. But at the same time, I'm kind of glad that stories like this do exist, because I think it does help people sort of understand what can go through someone's mind, even though this is obviously fictional.
Yeah, I actually haven't. I feel like I've heard of Rage, but I didn't read it, so I don't know exactly what it's about or anything like
It's
that.
very hard to find, but I know the general gist of the story is that there was a mass shooter at a school and they found Rage in the kid's backpack later. And
Oh,
it was just something they were sort of frequently finding that these kids had read and then went out and committed mass shootings and things like that. So I think,
huh.
that sort of drove it to be taken out of publication. But personally, I haven't read it yet. We do have a copy that has it in it because I believe it's in the Bachman books.
Mm. Yeah, I heard of it, but again, I've never read it. But nor do I really know the story of it. But I think in Apt Pupil, you do see. I mean, it kind of is like a two-hander. It goes between Doosander, and every now and then it goes to Todd's parents, but it's mostly Doosander and Todd,
Right.
and both of them are definitely experiencing a lot of. It's almost like I'm an addiction counselor, so it's almost like an addiction. Like they're both experiencing a lot of distress, in like sort of engaging in these behaviors. But then when they engage in the behaviors, the distress kind of goes away for a little bit, and then obviously it comes back eventually, and they need to sort of relieve themselves again by killing a cat or a homeless person or whatnot. So I think the distress inherent in both of their perspectives from the novella is potentially a deterrent. It's not like it's drawn out or
Right.
described or anything like that. So I think that that's probably also, again, like I said, I'm not sure what the Rage story is, or how much it goes into detail about violence or killing or anything like that. But that would be my guess as to why this is still published. It's also like a
Right.
hard story to read. Like it doesn't really, I don't know. From what I remember about reading it, it doesn't really glorify the killing, I guess, or it doesn't really.
Right.
I mean, it sort of meditates on it, but only when things kind of go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Like when he starts to have his heart attack and Todd needs to call an ambulance because
Yeah.
he's an old man digging a grave and he shouldn't be exerting himself that much. But,
Mm-hmm.
at this point Todd has sort of become not necessarily a master at manipulation, but he's very good at it by this point.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I have not read Rage either. I sort of just know the general gist of it. And I remember hearing about it being taken out of publication because when I did find out about that, I went and checked the copy my mom had to see if the story was even in that one because she had started buying the books back when they were originally coming out in
Mm-hmm.
paperback and everything like that. So it is in her copy, but I know any new printings of the Bachman books do not have it. But it's just one of those things where it's sort of interesting to see how similar stories in subject matter could have different impacts. And I'll probably have a lot of thoughts on Rage once I get to it. But one of the other big stories in this collection is The Body. And I did not know for a very long time that this and Stand By Me were one and the same because
Oh.
typically adaptations don't change the name that much. I mean, I do understand the name change, but it was just one of
Mm-hmm.
those things where I never put two and two together until I was like, oh, okay. So I had watched the movie and then read this. So it was similar to what happened with Shawshank, where I happened to see the adaptation first and then go through and read the stories because I just read all four of these stories at once. I was like, all right,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna do this in one go because I know I want to read at least two of the four for sure.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure I read it before I saw. I don't know what order I read it and saw the movie. I think I definitely read it before I saw the movie, and I think I remember, and I saw the movie when I was so young, and it didn't really, I wasn't a young boy in the '50s, so it didn't like resonate with me as much as it did for some other people, I think, and I think reading the novella again, at a slightly older age, it definitely gave me a lot different perspective on things. The kids, like we mentioned before, the kids are so free. They get to just do whatever they want. They just kind of get to
Right.
roam free on, wherever they want to go in the wilderness and see this dead body and swim in leech infested water and outrun trains and do all of these things. And I think that that's really sweet and freeing, but also they're so young and they're so vulnerable, and even though they don't really want to cry in front of each other. They do allow each other to be vulnerable and cry in front of each other sometimes. And I just really, that was kind of beautiful. And I know that just from, because the movie is so like beloved and cherished. And I, again, like when I saw it, I was like probably like 16 or something. And I was like, man, this is like, it definitely wasn't for me at the time.
Right.
And I mean, I knew that it was a good movie and good actors and a good story and very sweet or whatever. But I feel like after reading it again, I'm like, oh, I kind of want to watch that movie again, because that element of young boys kind of being vulnerable and open with each other is very interesting to me, especially given what we were talking about with Apt Pupil and talking about people sort of not processing their emotions and not being able to feel like they can be open and vulnerable in society with each other, especially with all this like toxic masculinity stuff going on, and men should be men, and and then on the other side of the spectrum, sort of non-binary gender and things like that. So it was definitely really interesting to revisit this story.
Plus, this one is from a child's perspective too. You have
Mm-hmm.
Gordy sort of being, he's taking the lead in telling the story, and you have him and his three friends, Chris, Teddy, and Vern. And it's one of those things where Stephen King is oddly good at writing these coming of age kid stories.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously it's very different from the sort of coming of age we see in Apt Pupil, but I think the body and it are sort of the epitome of what people think of when they think of, Stephen King writing these coming of age stories. And they're very different, but in a sense, he sort of really has this understanding of what kids are like in these small towns, because the story in different seasons takes place in Castle Rock. They change it for the movie. I don't really know why, but they change it for the movie,
Oh,
and they put them in Oregon instead. And I guess,
oh.
that's fine. I don't think I really noticed that when I was watching the movie, but it says that is a thing that happened, so I will believe them. That's just something that's weird, because Castle Rock is so important in Stephen King's stories. So to change it from that to Oregon, it's like, oh, all right, that was an interesting decision there. But this story, it's these kids, and I'm noticing that the key to getting your parents to not pay attention is to just tell them that you are at someone else's house and camping out in their backyard. And then no one will
Yes.
question it. And then you just leave a light on and you're good.
Yeah, exactly. Unless they think you're smoking cigarettes, and then that's a bad thing.
Right.
But yeah, I feel like, Stand By Me is another one of those movies where you tell people that Stephen King wrote it and they're like, what? Because
Yeah.
it's more of a story about humanity and connection and all of that, rather than a story about, horror and things like that. So I definitely, as soon as I finished the novella, I kind of looked it up, because obviously the narrator, he's kind of narrating it as an older man, I think, right? He's like, there's kind of two narrators. There's like him as an older man, but then I think he is narrating the parts where they're children as an older man, because then he's reflecting on being a writer. And
It's Gordy as an adult, I believe, who
right,
is
like
narrating the
reflecting.
story. Yeah, it's sort of this retrospective for him, and he's remembering this one time they found a dead body. And you really get a sense of how that has sort of sat with him over the
Mm-hmm.
years too. And I think that was a nice job, because even though he's an adult now remembering it, you still really get these kid-like aspects to it, and how Gordy liked writing and his friends made fun of him for, what he enjoyed doing. And you also have a lot of family dynamics, because then you have the group of older boys as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I really, so, I've read a lot of not all, but a lot of Stephen King's works, and he rarely, except for on writing, he rarely writes about himself. And in this one, there was one part where he was reflecting on, writing about yourself as a, futile thing or whatever. And so this is, in the second time reading it through, it definitely feels like more autobiographical than anything else that I've ever read him write. And
Right.
so I looked up online. I was like, is Stand By Me like a true story, or is Stand By Me or Bobby? I think I looked it up both ways. And there was an article from like AMC 10 years ago, and it had quotes from Stephen King in it, which I kind of took with a grain of salt. But one of the stories was that when he was 4, he was playing with a friend on train tracks, and the friend got killed, and he doesn't remember it. But then people told him that he may have potentially been there, and he may have potentially, seen his friend get run over by the train and all this stuff. But he says he doesn't remember it, and blah blah blah. So, I mean, at the very least, he had a childhood growing up very. Sounds like he had a childhood growing up very similar to the one in the body, where he, grew up in the 50s, and he was able to kind of run around and buy Cokes and, fry hamburger over a camp stove, and all of the swam and got leeches, and potentially it all kind of felt very true to him, just in the way that he was writing it. And then if you think about it, and extrapolate to like It, where that was also very personal. It was very similar, where the kids are running around and they're kind of just like, unsupervised and doing whatever they want, and living off the land or living off whatever they can buy and steal. And I don't know, I just think it's really interesting because you don't really, as much as it might be true, you don't really get a lot of Stephen King writing about himself, but it did feel like that to me.
Plus, you have the ending, which is just crushing, because
Mm.
then you realize that there's sort of this guilt showing from Gordy as well, because he's the only one who made it past being a young adult
Mm-hmm.
of his group of friends. And the odds of that happening seem very, very low. And the fact that it did happen, and he's sort of the only one who is left of his friends to have this memory and sort of just have to still kind of cope with it on his own, is really fascinating. And we have the older brother of Chris, who is Richard, and Billy is Vern's older brother. So they sort of lead the group of those older boys who pester the younger boys and beat them up and everything like that. But then you also have Vince DeHardens. I'm always iffy on the pronunciation, but that's a last name we
Oh
see a
yeah.
lot in Stephen King. It came up in Castle Rock, and that's
Oh.
something that is very interesting to link back to, because obviously if the movie is taking place in Oregon, that name kind of doesn't make as much sense there as it does in Castle
Mm.
Rock, because I don't know if you remember in Castle Rock when he goes out to the woods and he finds sort of this decrepit house that's, the barber shop, and the guy, I believe it's Vince's brother, who is still at the house.
Oh. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't sometimes I don't always catch all the like in,
It's
different
hard because
things
there's so
about
many.
there's so many. And and the breathing method has actually a really big one, which is when I read it, I was like, oh my God. But this one also has like a lot of little ones, like you said. But yeah, sometimes the last names just really, because he does have different like family names that pop up a lot, and sometimes
Yeah.
I just pass right over it. Like I don't, unless it's like something like a major character from like one of the books that I've read multiple times, like The Stand or something. Like
Or if it's like
I don't
Cujo popping
necessarily.
up.
Right? Yeah, Cujo. I mean, come on. Yeah, like it doesn't necessarily stick with me. Like I'm sure there's a lot of other different references and things. Like when I watched 11/22/63, there were so many references in there, and I actually had the opportunity to talk to Bridget Carpenter about like all the different like the showrunner about all the different references, and she was telling me about the signage and this and that, and I was like, oh my God, like I wouldn't have even picked up on half of these things had you not told me about them. And I'm like, an ardent like avid Stephen King reader,
Yeah.
and I would not have like, what was, I can't, there was some sign for like a milkman, and it was some specific last name, and I was like very very obscure, but I was like, oh my God, I would never have picked up on that if you hadn't told me.
Castle Rock was certainly the same way, because it wasn't a direct adaptation of anything. They sort of just brought in all of these stories. Cujo gets mentioned, Shawshank is in
Mm.
it, that family house is there. And then I believe there's even like an ice cream shop that is named after one of the other family names that is pretty common. And it's just a lot to try and keep track of. But I do like
Hmm.
how, because the story came so early in his career. And I don't think that's even the first time we've seen that last name. I think it came up in Carrie originally, one of the
Oh,
teachers
probably.
or something. And I don't even know if it was like the main gym teacher lady, but it's one of those things where I'm getting so deep into this that I feel like things are going to get jumbled unless I have like everything right in front of me, nicely laid out.
Have you ever seen there's I don't even know where it is. I haven't seen it recently, but it came out a while ago and it's like a web of all the
Yes.
connections between
Yeah.
all of the Stephen King books and it's crazy.
I frequently try to look at that.
Yeah, I should look at it again because I've definitely read. He's so prolific that I haven't read all of his books. Because he keeps coming out with books, and
Right.
but I do read like a lot of a good portion of Stephen King books a year. I go back and read old ones, and I read new ones, and I should look at it again because it's always interesting to see how those worlds connect and collide for sure.
Yeah, my thing is I started with probably a very random book. I believe the first Stephen King book I read was The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. It was either that
Oh,
or The Green Mile because my mom has the serialized Green Mile books. So they're like teeny
mm-hmm,
tiny and there's like six of
mm-hmm.
them. So it was one of the two of those. Obviously, The Green Mile is a huge story, but The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon is not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Stephen King. So,
Mm-mm.
to have that be one of the early books I read, it was interesting, and I don't really remember all of the details of it because it was so long ago. So I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but a lot of these things I'm reading for the first time or watching for the first time, so it's definitely an experience to sort of see how things piece together. And obviously just being a fan of Stephen King for a while now, even without reading things, I've known about them. I just recently read Cujo, and it was one of those things where it's like I kind of knew what was going to happen because that story has been talked about for so long.
Yeah, Cujo's boring. I Cujo's boring, and Christine is boring, and those books. I don't know. I don't really love those. Because they're just not. I mean, they are about people, but they're just about like this. Like I don't know. They're both of those books were boring to me. But I like prefer where there's like people and they're like interact. I mean, there's people in those books like that, like characters. I don't even know who they are, but
Right.
but yeah, yeah, but like Cujo is definitely so ingrained in our culture. When a dog is crazy, people call it Cujo, and
We
things
do that
like
with our
that.
dog.
So.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think he's definitely, now you've got me thinking, I don't know. I have no idea what the first Stephen King book I read was. I carried a lot of those like mass market paperbacks in my backpack in high school. That's actually one of the only, I'm so jealous of your mom that she still has all of her Stephen King books because I used to have like, a ton of mass market paperbacks from Stephen King. And then I gave, except for The Stand, which is like duct taped together.
Yeah, that's kind of how her copy is. There's like tape all over it.
Yeah, my sister taped it together for me, and then I reread it again a couple of years ago, and it was like falling apart again, and I had taped it again, and I so that's the only one that I have from back then, and I'm like, I wish that I had kept my old books. My dad, I think, has some Dark Tower books, like hardcover from like when they first came out, so I should see
Right.
if he still has those and if I can take them.
Yeah, sometimes I'm scared to read them because like the Bachman books, I touched it and like the cover ripped and I was like, tape, where are
Oh
you?
yeah, yeah. Oh, I know. Well, yeah, The Stand. The second time I read it, and I think it's interesting because you're saying like this is the first time you're reading a lot of these books, and I mean me too. Like I just read The Dead Zone recently, and for the first time. But like I read The Stand the first time when I was 16, and then I read it again when I was 32, I think. So like a year or two ago, and it was like very different. Like I was sympathizing with different characters and I had like a different perspective on it. And then with the different seasons too, like same thing. Like I read it when I was in my mid-teens and I'm reading it again now. And it's, different things pop out at you and different, you sympathize with different characters and you see different things. And I definitely, Stephen King's definitely like rereadable for sure. And so my thing with The Stand is that I'm like, okay, I'll read it every 16 years now. I'll
Right.
read it like I'm 16 and I was 32, so I'll read it when I'm 48, and I'll just read it every 16 years, and that'll be that. I don't know if I'll be able to wait another 16 years though, because I do love that book. But I think he is so prolific and he's written so much that it is hard to read all of his stuff, even a first time.
Yeah.
So much less a second time. But I do like to revisit those books.
That's kind of my goal, to just read a bunch of these for the first time. I probably will have to reread the first two, like Green Mile and The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, just because I'm
Mm,
not as clear on the details of those books. And sometimes I get the movie adaptations confused with the books. Like I
mm,
did that with the Shining episode. I mentioned the twins. I was like, oh, they're not in the book, are they?
mhm. Yeah, it's been a while since I've read The Shining too. Maybe The Shining was the first. Now you got me thinking. I'm gonna like be thinking about this because I gave up on it because it was too free. The clown was too freaky at the beginning, and I couldn't do it. So I didn't read it until I was late. Until I don't know, I was in my 20s. I didn't read it until then, and then I just reread it before the movie came out. But I always had like a Stephen King paper book in my backpack, and I just can't remember which one I started with. That's gonna drive me crazy. But
Apologies.
no, I'll definitely be thinking about it. I wish I had the old ones, but alas, I do not have my. They're all went to some Salvation Army somewhere.
Yeah, I've posted a couple pictures on the Chat Cemetery Instagram for like what I'm reading, and some people saw the Cujo copy that I was reading. They were like, "Wow, that
Um,
is so old."
oh, I wish I had my old ones. I do. I have the stand, so I will treasure that forever, and that'll be my
Yeah.
copy.
But I do think The Body is one of those stories that is fairly easy to want to reread. And I think because there are so many characters in this, you can probably pick up on things that you didn't pick up on the first time. And having only
Hmm.
read this once, I think it is something that eventually I will revisit, just not anytime in like the next 3 years doing this podcast. But it's one of
Hmm.
those things where, some of, especially his longer books, I imagine if you read it 3 or 4 times, you'll still be picking up on things in that book because of
Hmm.
the length of it. And same with The Stand. There's so many characters there where when I was reading it, it took me a while to get into it. And then I was like, okay, once I got into it, it was like, all right, I want to know more. Keep going, keep going. And that sort of led me to kind of binge read the rest of that book. But with the novellas, because they're short, it's like they're easier to reread and everything like that. But I
Hmm.
do want to sort of rope us back in a little here. I love me some tangents, but we should get to the breathing method before we get
Sure.
too deep into this podcast here. But this one, it was quite an interesting one to end on. I love starting with Shawshank and getting that very character driven story. And to be honest, a lot of these are character driven here, but like you said, this one doesn't have quite as much of an arc as the other three do. So
Hmm.
it was just one of those things where I was a little taken aback by it when I first read it. I was like, "Wait, what what did I just read?" And I feel like sometimes in this one I had to go back and reread pages just to be sure that what I read was what I read.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually read these all out of order when like rereading them. And the
Mhm.
breathing method, was one that I hadn't read when I originally read this book, the different seasons. I don't know why, but I just never got to it. But I read them all out of order. I think I read like Apt Pupil, and then I read the breathing method, and then I read the body, and then I read Shawshank. So I unfortunately didn't read them in order, but it was definitely interesting. It was a little harder for me to get into because there's this like old man, and he's talking about like he's foreshadowing, and he's talking about this
Yeah.
place, and it's like it just takes forever to get started, and then finally the guy actually tells the story, and it's interesting and it's sweet, and then really like nothing really happens until the very end of the story, and which is I mean definitely full of horror and definitely very interesting to read, and it takes place on Christmas Eve, which is very festive, especially
Not so
given
much
that
in this
Christmas
story.
is coming up. And I think I feel really bad, and I was fully expecting the kid to be a character in some other story. I don't think he
Right.
was though, but I was like, huh, I wonder, like I thought about it for a minute, and I was like, oh, he's like a professor or something and something or other, and I was like, I don't think that's him, but or that's anyone specific. But it was interesting to think about the connection, any sort of potential connections, because at the very end Stevens is talking to him, and he's the I forget the main character's name, but he's asking about, what is, like, how many, he wants to ask, like, what is this place, but then he ends up asking, like, how many rooms or whatever. And I was like, oh, that sounds like interesting. It sounds like familiar. It sounds like something else. And so I was like, oh my God, it's probably a reference to the Dark Tower. And it was, and I was like, and I looked it up online, and there were all these like Reddit threads and stuff on it. And I was like, oh my God, that's so, and that is what made the story really interesting for me.
I haven't yet dived into the Stephen King Reddit while doing this podcast because I know I'll just go down so many rabbit holes and get very distracted. But it is something, I should consider, because I think there are a lot of people out there who dive into this stuff so deep that they come up with their own theories, but then they also make these connections that, like you said, there's just so many that sometimes it's hard to keep track of them all. So I feel like Reddit might be a good place to go, and that, that big web image connecting everything to its rightful place. You have to zoom in very, very far on it, though,
yes,
to follow it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I was, when I was reading it, and there were just certain things that he had said within the book that made me like think of the Dark Tower, and also the connection, maybe the recent connection of Castle Rock to the Dark Tower also kind of made me think about it. But because the Dark Tower really connects to everything. So I was like, oh, that sounds like it. And then I just looked up Dark Tower and the breathing method, and then a bunch of one of them was Reddit, I think there were a couple other ones, but it popped up. I think there was like a Stephen King wiki that popped up, and I was like, oh, and like I said, like that was the most interesting part of that novella to me, just because the rest of it just felt so, I don't know, it just felt really draggy, and it was like a story within a story, and I don't know, I was just like, and the main character was boring. I don't know. I don't know why.
This one, to me, instead of feeling character driven like the other stories, it just felt more tragedy driven, because she's going into labor, and then she's decapitated, and then still going into it's very strange how the events play out in this one. And we do get a little backstory between Sandra and Dr. McCarran, because he sort of goes back and is like, okay, she came in and she was like, I'm going to have this baby no matter what, and obviously she accomplishes that somehow, but it just sort of felt a little odd considering the other three stories that this one is paired with. And I'm not saying that collections necessarily need to flow super well, but typically they have a theme, and you can really feel that with this one, I feel like, until this story, and you're like, well, this wasn't like the others, and it sort of just leaves you wanting a little more out of it by the end.
Yeah, the main character's name is escaping me, but the fact that he never told a story really bothered me. I was like waiting for him to tell a story and waiting for him to tell a story, and then he never told a story, and I was like, why isn't he ever telling a story? He needs to tell a story. And
it is Dr. McCarran who is telling the story from his perspective, because he was her doctor, right? I believe.
It's not the guy who's telling the story at the beginning, but it's like another member of the club or whatnot. An older guy. So
the lawyer guy. Yes. I don't know his name either.
So he, and so he never tells a story. And I was just waiting. I was like, oh, maybe he'll tell a story. Nope, they never told a story. It was fine. It's definitely and again, like this was the first time I read it. So maybe if I revisit in another time or another place, I would enjoy it a little bit more, but right. And I felt really bad for Sandra, and that was really sad and upsetting, and that she, got decapitated and died. Of course, there's like ominous, foreshadowing throughout the whole story, that something horrible is going to happen to her baby. But I don't know. It's just, it's like a very, I guess it's like a simple story wrapped up in like a complex idea of this like place that they're in. And again, like the place that they were in, and the fact that it sort of connects to Stephen King's stories in a larger sense is much more interesting to me than the actual story.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do with the adaptation, because a semi-recent example is The Haunting of Hill House. It's totally different from the book, but it sort of keeps the core of the house really being a character that I think I like that adaptation enough, because I don't need every single adaptation to be exact. Sometimes you can take these different spins on a story and have something good come out of it, like they did with The Haunting of Hill House. But, The Breathing Method, it's been announced for 2020, and Scott Derrickson is directing it. I don't really know too many details other than that. I do believe Scott Derrickson has done quite a few big things. He did Doctor Strange and The Exorcism of Emily Rose. So he definitely knows his way around these sort of surreal and horror kind of stories. And it'll be interesting to see, and obviously I'll have to add that to the list of episodes to do here because, this, as you know, like you said, Stephen King has a lot of books and stories to go through. So I believe at the moment this is like a 3-year project, and it'll just continue as he continues to release things, and adaptations are forever going to be made.
Forever.
I do think I'm going to be skipping a few things because I don't know how many people want to listen to me discuss 10 Children of the Corn movies.
Oh, yeah. Geez,
I don't know if I want to listen to me discuss 10 Children of the Corn movies. No offense to everyone who made those movies, but that's yeah, a lot. That's too much.
I don't even think I've seen. I don't think I've read it or seen it. Maybe I saw it a long time ago, but yeah, I definitely. Maybe I read it a long time. I don't know. I know the story, but I don't know how I know the story. It was probably, my teen Stephen King phase.
It's hard to keep track of which stories were in which collections because some novellas he'll obviously release as standalones too. He's been doing that recently with, Elevation and last year's Wendy's Button Box that he co-wrote. So it'll definitely be interesting to see not only what continues to come, but what comes of this adaptation, because it's the only one of these stories that has not had an adaptation yet, which is kind of surprising, just because I feel like almost everything of his up until the recent releases have been adapted. Even some of the more recent things, Dr. Sleep is in the works, and while that isn't a super recent book, it is one of those things where you're like, okay, yeah, you kind of know this is obviously going to happen.
Yeah. Oh God, I'm so excited for that adaptation.
I still need to read it. Obviously, I need to read a lot of things.
I reread it when they announced Ewan McGregor as Danny, but I had forgotten the twists in it from the first time I read it when it first came out, and it wasn't even that long ago that I had read it. I think I just read it so fast that and then I reread it and I was like, oh yeah, that makes I remember that, and I'm very, very excited to see what they do with it.
Yeah, I'm excited to read that one, but it's going to be a while before I get there because I am doing my best to do this in order as much as possible. Sometimes there's discrepancies with release dates on certain things, and I'm like, I'm just going to go with what, Wikipedia says, even though that can be iffy. But for the most part, I feel like Wikipedia has been kept in check a lot more lately than it was when it first started.
Yeah.
Or the Stephen King fandom Wikia page or something like that is probably a little more accurate because people love them some Stephen King.
Oh yes, for sure. Yeah, he's a master of horror, master of storytelling. Definitely gets to the core of who we are, and definitely makes people feel things. Other than horror too. So I don't know. I love him.
Yeah, and I know you signed up for some of the recent stuff, but I'm sure you will be back on again before we get to that, within the next 3 years.
Yes, that would be ideal.
But Erin, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. I know I have discussed Shawshank in specific on my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom, but it's always interesting to talk to different people about, sort of these things that we experience in different ways, because no one person experiences a Stephen King book the same way, I would imagine.
Oh, definitely. That's why there's going to be adaptations of his work forever, ever and always.
Yeah, and there's always going to be new technology to try and improve on how certain things look and everything like that. And we've already seen that happen, how many different versions of Salem's Lot or The Stand or, whatever.
Well, I need another one of The Stand, but I wouldn't even mind another one of Salem's Lot because I can't I think there's two, and I can't find either one of them because I read that maybe last year or 2 years ago, and for the first time, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, I'd really love to see like the movie version, and like I couldn't find it anywhere, and I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe they'll.
The 1979 one is very interesting. I believe the one with who is it? I think it might be Rob Lowe, or is that The Stand?
Hmm.
I don't know.
He's in The Stand, but he could very well be in Salem's Lot too.
Yeah, I have no idea. There's so many things to keep up with that I'm getting them all mixed up, and I have a nice spreadsheet in front of my face. So, but again, thank you for coming on. And
Oh, thank you for having me.
if anyone wants to keep up with the podcast on social media, we are at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. I elected not to make a Facebook page for this because I don't know. Facebook is weird right now, so I'm just leaving that be. And Twitter and Instagram is where you can find us. But as always, to the listeners, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.